In 1950, Carl Jung was treating a patient who had spent 8 years in intensive analytical work. She'd integrated her shadow, confronting the qualities she'd rejected in herself. She'd worked through her anima projection, developing her own masculine authority instead of seeking it in men. She'd experienced profound synchronicities that confirmed her psychological transformation. By every measure Jung had developed, she appeared to have achieved complete individuation, psychological wholeness. 6 months after ending therapy, she returned to Jung in crisis. Her personality was fragmenting. She was experiencing dissociative episodes, losing time, feeling like multiple competing selves were tearing her apart. Everything she'd integrated was coming undone. Jung spent months working with her to understand what had happened. His conclusion was disturbing. She had integrated too much, too fast, before her ego had developed the capacity to contain the material she'd accessed. She'd confused psychological inflation with genuine individuation. She'd identified with the self, the totality of her psyche, before her ego was strong enough to relate to the self without being overwhelmed by it. Jung wrote in his notes, "Individuation is not the dissolution of the ego. It's the transformation of the ego's relationship to the totality of the psyche." She attempted to become the self rather than to establish conscious relationship with the self. The result was fragmentation, not wholeness. This case forced Jung to revise his understanding of individuation. He'd spent decades developing the concept, the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole, integrating all the disparate aspects of their psyche into unified consciousness. But this patient's breakdown revealed something he hadn't fully articulated. Most people never individuate, and those who attempt it prematurely risk triggering the exact fragmentation individuation is meant to resolve. Jung identified 3 reasons most people never become whole. They attempt individuation before their ego structure can handle it, social pressure actively works against individuation, or they mistake psychological inflation for genuine wholeness. And even for those psychologically prepared to begin the journey, individuation requires 3 distinct ego deaths, each involving the dissolution of structures you've spent your entire life building. Today, I'll show you Jung's complete theory of individuation, what it actually is, the 4 stages every person must pass through, the 3 reasons most people never make it past stage 1, the 3 ego deaths required for genuine wholeness, Jung's method for determining whether you're ready to begin, and the 6 signs that distinguish real individuation from inflation or delusion. If you're ready to understand why most people never become psychologically whole and what it takes to actually complete the journey, comment this: "I choose wholeness." But first, you need to understand what individuation actually is, because the popular interpretation misses what makes Jung's discovery so psychologically demanding and so dangerous when attempted prematurely. Most people think individuation means finding yourself or being authentic or self-actualization. That surface understanding completely misses what made Jung's concept so radical and what makes the process so psychologically dangerous when misunderstood. Jung developed his theory of individuation over his entire career, but the seeds appeared during his Red Book period when he was confronting his own psychological fragmentation. He observed that most people live as collections of competing subpersonalities, unconscious complexes, projected qualities, and unlived potential, never achieving psychological unity. He coined the term individuation from the Latin individuus, meaning undivided or indivisible. Individuation is the process of becoming psychologically whole, integrating all the fragmented, split-off, projected, and unconscious aspects of your psyche into unified consciousness. Jung defined it precisely. Individuation means becoming a single, homogeneous being, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. But Jung was adamant about distinguishing individuation from several concepts it's commonly confused with. First, Individuation is not individualism, the ego's assertion of itself against others. Jung wrote that individuation does not isolate you from the world. It connects you more genuinely to others because you're relating as your actual self rather than through persona masks or unconscious projections. Second, individuation is not self-improvement or optimization. You're not becoming a better version of yourself. You're becoming more completely yourself, which includes integrating qualities society deems negative, accepting limitations you'd prefer to transcend, and embodying aspects of yourself that make you socially unacceptable. Third, individuation is not finding your true self that was always there waiting to be discovered. Jung taught that the self, the totality of your psyche, is not something you find. It's something you become through the process of integration. You're not uncovering a hidden true self. You're creating psychological wholeness from fragmentation. What made Jung's concept radical was his distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is the center of your conscious awareness, the I that thinks, decides, experiences. The self is the totality of your psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, integrated and split off. The self includes everything you are and everything you could become. Most people believe the ego is who they are. Jung's discovery was that the ego is a small fragment of a much larger totality. Individuation is not the strengthening of the ego. It's the establishment of a conscious relationship between the ego and the self, the ego remaining as the center of consciousness while recognizing it's not the totality. Jung observed that the danger in individuation is ego inflation, the ego identifying with the self, believing I am the totality. This is not individuation, this is psychosis. The individuated person maintains the ego as center of consciousness while establishing relationship with the vastly greater self. Another crucial distinction: individuation is not about becoming special or superior. Jung noted that individuation leads you to become more completely who you specifically are, which makes you more ordinary, not more special. You're not transcending human nature. You're embodying your specific human nature more completely. The process Jung described involves integrating 4 layers of the psyche progressively. First, the persona, the social mask you wear. Second, the shadow, the qualities you've rejected. Third, the anima or animus, your opposite sex psychological qualities. Fourth, the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious, the universal patterns underlying individual experience. But here's what makes individuation so difficult. You must integrate these layers in order, and you cannot skip stages. Attempting to integrate archetypal material before integrating your personal shadow triggers the exact fragmentation his patient experienced. Each stage must be completed before the next can safely begin. Jung was definitive. Most people never individuate because they never complete even the first stage, confrontation with the persona. They spend their entire lives identified with their social roles, never questioning whether the person they present to the world bears any relationship to who they actually are. Understanding the 4 stages reveals why genuine individuation is so rare, and why most people who claim to be individuating are actually trapped in the first stage, mistaking persona adjustment for psychological transformation. Jung documented that individuation unfolds through 4 distinct stages, each requiring the integration of progressively deeper layers of the psyche. Each stage involves a death, the dissolution of structures you've built your identity on, followed by rebirth into more complete consciousness. The first stage of individuation requires recognizing that the person you present to the world, your persona, is a mask, not your true nature. Jung described the persona as a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask designed to make a definite impression upon others while concealing the true nature of the individual. Everyone develops a persona. It's psychologically necessary. You need some interface between your inner world and social demands. The problem occurs when you become completely identified with your persona, believing the mask is who you are. Jung observed that Modern society encourages total persona identification. You're rewarded for being a good employee, good parent, good citizen, for fulfilling your roles effectively. But if you never question whether these roles reflect your actual nature, you remain psychologically fragmented, living someone else's idea of who you should be. Stage 1. Individuation requires asking, who am I beneath my social roles? What aspects of myself have I suppressed to maintain my persona? What would remain if all my roles were stripped away? This questioning is psychologically destabilizing because your entire social identity is built on persona identification. When you begin recognizing the persona as a mask, you experience disorientation. If you're not your job, your relationships, your achievements, then who are you? Jung noted that many people abort individuation at this stage. The anxiety of not knowing who they are beneath their roles becomes intolerable. They retreat into stronger persona identification, often through career advancement, relationship escalation, or achievement seeking, anything to avoid the void beneath the mask. But those who persist through stage 1 begin noticing the gap between their persona and their actual experience. They feel like they're playing a role. They experience themselves as inauthentic. Social situations that once felt comfortable now feel suffocating. This is not depression or dysfunction, it's the necessary disintegration that precedes integration. The completion of stage 1 occurs when you can wear your persona consciously, using social masks when appropriate while knowing they're masks, not your identity. You become able to function in society without being possessed by your social role. Jung documented that most people never complete stage 1. They die having lived their entire lives identified with their persona, never discovering who they actually were beneath their roles. This is not individuation. This is unconscious social conformity. The second stage requires confronting everything your persona has rejected. Jung taught that the shadow contains all the qualities your conscious personality doesn't identify with, everything you've deemed unacceptable, shameful, inferior, or incompatible with your self-image. Stage 2 begins when you start noticing the shadow through projection. You see qualities in others that disgust, fascinate, or trigger you. These are almost always your own shadow qualities that you refuse to recognize in yourself. The anger you hate in others is your suppressed anger. The arrogance you despise is your disowned superiority. The weakness you can't tolerate is your rejected vulnerability. Jung wrote that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The shadow doesn't disappear because you don't acknowledge it. It operates unconsciously, sabotaging your conscious intentions, erupting in uncharacteristic behavior, projecting itself onto others. Stage 2. Individuation requires withdrawing these projections and owning your shadow. You must recognize, the qualities I judge harshly in others exist in me. The behaviors I claim I'd never engage in are behaviors I'm capable of under the right conditions. The person I present as isn't the totality of who I am. This is psychologically brutal because it requires admitting you're not who you think you are. Your self-image, carefully constructed over decades, must be dismantled to include the qualities you've spent your life rejecting. Jung observed that shadow integration is where most people who make it past stage 1 abort individuation. Confronting your shadow means admitting you're capable of cruelty, selfishness, cowardice, dishonesty, whatever qualities you've built your identity in opposition to. Most people prefer their idealized self-image to psychological honesty. The method for stage 2 is what I covered in my shadow integration video. Identifying your shadow through projection, dialoguing with shadow qualities, gradually integrating them into conscious personality. But the key insight is that shadow integration must be complete before stage 3 can begin. Jung documented patients who attempted to integrate archetypal material, stage 4 content, before completing shadow work. The result was invariably catastrophic. The ego cannot handle transpersonal archetypal contents if it's still defending against personal shadow material. Attempting it triggers fragmentation, not individuation. Stage 2 completion is marked by decreased projection, increased psychological honesty, and the capacity to hold both light and dark aspects of yourself without splitting into all good or all bad. You become more human, less idealized, more real. The third stage requires integrating your opposite sex psychological qualities, what Jung called the anima in men and the animus in women. As I covered in my Anima-Animus video, these are the unconscious opposite sex figures that carry all the qualities your conscious personality doesn't identify with based on your gender. For men, the anima carries receptivity, emotional depth, intuition, relationship to the unconscious, qualities Western culture typically codes as feminine that many men have never developed. For women, the animus carries assertiveness, logical analysis, independence, decisive action, qualities coded as masculine that many women have suppressed. Stage 3. Individuation requires developing these opposite qualities within yourself rather than projecting them onto romantic partners. Men must develop actual emotional capacity, actual intuitive awareness, actual receptivity. Women must develop actual assertiveness, actual intellectual authority, actual independence. Jung was clear that anima-animus integration doesn't make you androgynous in behavior or gender expression. It makes you psychologically complete, capable of accessing both masculine and feminine psychological functions depending on what the situation requires. The challenge of stage 3 is that it requires violating your culture's gender conditioning. A man developing his anima will be called weak, emotional, unmasculine. A woman developing her animus will be called aggressive, cold, unfeminine. The social pressure to remain psychologically gendered is enormous. Jung observed that most people who complete shadow work still abort individuation at stage 3. They cannot tolerate the social rejection that comes from developing their contrasexual qualities. They'd rather remain psychologically incomplete than face being labeled gender deviant. But those who persist discover that integrating opposite sex qualities doesn't diminish their core gender identity, it completes it. An integrated man is more fully masculine because he's no longer unconsciously possessed by repressed feminine qualities. An integrated woman is more fully feminine because she's no longer compensating for undeveloped masculine capacities. Stage 3 completion is marked by the capacity to function psychologically, regardless of gender expectations, feeling deeply when depth is needed, thinking analytically when analysis is required, being receptive when receptivity serves, acting decisively when action is appropriate. The fourth and final stage of individuation involves what Jung called self-realization, establishing conscious relationship between the ego and the self, the totality of the psyche. Jung described this stage as the most dangerous and the most necessary. You must encounter archetypal contents from the collective unconscious, universal patterns that transcend personal experience. But if your ego attempts to identify with these archetypal powers, the result is not self-realization, it's psychotic inflation. Stage 4 cannot begin until stages 1 through 3 are complete. You must have disidentified from your persona, integrated your personal shadow, and developed your contrasexual qualities. Only then is your ego strong enough and flexible enough to encounter archetypal material without being overwhelmed by it. The method Jung developed for stage 4 was active imagination, directly engaging autonomous figures from the unconscious through visualization, dialogue, and symbolic expression. But Jung only taught this technique to psychologically stable patients who'd completed the earlier stages. What happens in stage 4 is that you encounter aspects of your psyche that are not personal, archetypes like the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, the hero. These are universal patterns inherited from the collective unconscious. They carry enormous psychological power. The danger Jung identified is ego inflation, the ego identifying with archetypal power and believing I am the wise one, or I am the divine feminine, or I have transcended ordinary humanity. This is not self-realization. This is the ego usurping archetypal identity, which inevitably leads to catastrophic collapse. Jung taught that the ego must remain ego while establishing relationship with the self. You don't become the self, You become conscious of the self as vastly greater than your ego, and you allow your ego to serve the self's intentions rather than demanding the self serve your ego's desires. Stage 4. Completion, true individuation, is marked by what Jung called the ego-self axis. Your ego remains as the center of your conscious awareness, but it's no longer attempting to control the totality. Instead, it's in dialogue with the self, receiving direction from depths beyond conscious knowledge, living in service to a purpose that transcends personal desires. Jung was adamant that very few people reach stage 4. Most never make it past persona identification. Those who encounter their shadow often stop there. Fewer still integrate their anima or animus, and only the rarest individuals complete self-realization without falling into inflation. But understanding the 4 stages doesn't explain why completion is so rare. Jung identified 3 specific reasons that prevent most people from ever individuating, and recognizing these reasons reveals whether you're actually on the path or merely fantasizing about transformation while remaining psychologically unchanged. After decades of clinical work, Jung identified 3 primary reasons that prevent genuine individuation. These aren't moral failures, they're psychological and social realities that make completing the journey extraordinarily rare. The first reason most people never individuate is attempting the process before their ego structure can handle it. Jung discovered that individuation requires a strong, stable ego. Paradoxically, you must have a well-developed ego before you can transcend ego identification. Weak ego structure makes individuation attempts catastrophic. The ego is the center of conscious awareness, the organizing principle of your conscious personality. A weak ego cannot distinguish between self and other, cannot maintain boundaries, cannot tolerate ambiguity or paradox, cannot hold tension between opposites. Jung observed that modern therapeutic culture often encourages people to let go of ego or transcend ego before they've developed stable ego functioning. This is psychologically disastrous. You cannot transcend what you haven't developed. Attempting to dissolve ego boundaries before those boundaries are stable triggers psychosis, not enlightenment. The signs of weak ego structure include difficulty saying no, chronic fusion with others' emotions, inability to maintain consistent identity across contexts, paralysis in decision-making, overwhelming anxiety when facing choices, or dissociative tendencies. If you have weak ego structure and attempt shadow integration, you risk being overwhelmed by shadow material rather than integrating it. If you attempt anima or animus work, you risk complete possession by these figures rather than conscious relationship with them. If you attempt archetypal encounter, you risk psychotic inflation or fragmentation. Jung documented multiple patients who attempted individuation prematurely. The pattern was consistent: initial excitement about spiritual growth, rapid destabilization as unconscious material emerged faster than ego could process it, eventually either psychological breakdown requiring hospitalization or defensive retreat into rigid persona identification, more extreme than before. Jung's clinical guideline was clear: do not attempt conscious individuation work if you have active mental illness, recent trauma, substance dependency, or unstable life circumstances. Build ego strength first through therapy, stable relationships, and mastery of basic life functions. Only then consider deeper work. The tragedy is that people most drawn to individuation often have the weakest ego structures. They're seeking transformation to escape psychological pain rather than approaching it from a foundation of stability. Jung noted that genuine individuation begins from strength, not from desperation. If you're using it as escape from your life problems, you're not ready. The second reason most people never individuate is that society actively works against the process. Jung taught that collective culture requires conformity. It needs you to fulfill your social roles, maintain your persona, project your shadow onto designated enemies, and never question the collective values. Individuation threatens all of this. When you begin individuating, you stop being a reliable participant in collective unconsciousness. You withdraw your projections, which means you stop seeing designated enemies as purely evil. You question cultural values rather than assuming their absolute truth. You prioritize psychological wholeness over social approval. Society experiences this as betrayal. Jung noted that the individualizing person appears to others as selfish, weird, antisocial, or even dangerous. Family members feel abandoned when you stop playing your assigned role. Colleagues feel uncomfortable when you stop maintaining the collective persona. Friends feel betrayed when you stop sharing their projections. The social pressure to abort individuation is immense. You'll be called selfish for prioritizing your psychological development over others' comfort. You'll be labeled crazy for taking your dreams and inner life seriously. You'll be accused of abandoning your responsibilities when you stop living through persona identification. Jung documented that most people who begin individuating retreat when they encounter this social pressure. The cost of continuing, potential loss of relationships, career setbacks, social isolation, feels too high. They convince themselves that conforming is more mature or responsible than completing their psychological development. The mechanism is that collective culture operates on unconsciousness. It requires people to remain identified with persona, to project shadow onto acceptable targets, to never question whether their values are authentic or merely inherited. When you begin individuating, you're no longer predictable or controllable by collective norms. Jung observed in his own life how individuation created social rupture. His break with Freud wasn't just intellectual, it was the result of Jung's unwillingness to conform to Freudian orthodoxy. His Red Book period made colleagues question his sanity. His later work on alchemy and synchronicity was dismissed as mystical nonsense by the scientific establishment. He wrote that the individuating person must accept a degree of social solitude, not because they withdraw from humanity, but because they can no longer participate unconsciously in collective projections and conformity. This loneliness is the price of psychological wholeness. The test comes when your emerging authentic self conflicts with others' expectations of who you should be. If you retreat to maintain relationships, you've chosen collective approval over individuation. If you continue while maintaining compassion for others' discomfort, you're on the path. Jung was clear. Individuation is not selfishness. It's the most responsible thing you can do. Becoming conscious enough that you stop unconsciously projecting onto others, stop requiring them to carry your unlived potential, stop demanding they conform to your unconscious expectations. But society rarely recognizes this responsibility. It only sees that you're no longer conforming. The third and most insidious reason people never complete individuation is mistaking psychological inflation for genuine wholeness. Jung called this the most common and most dangerous error, identifying the ego with the self. Inflation occurs when the ego confuses itself with archetypal power. You have an experience of expanded consciousness, perhaps through synchronicity, active imagination, spiritual practice, or psychedelic experience, and you conclude, I am enlightened. I have transcended ego. I am one with the divine. Jung was definitive. This is not individuation. This is the ego usurping self-identity. You have not transcended the ego. The ego has inflated itself by identifying with transpersonal contents it encountered. The inflated person believes they've completed individuation when they've actually just begun encountering archetypal material. They confuse the initial excitement of touching something greater than personal ego with the completion of psychological development. Signs of inflation include believing you have special powers or insights others lack, teaching transformation before you've completed it yourself, claiming enlightenment or awakening, dismissing psychological problems as already integrated, inability to hear criticism without feeling attacked, or grandiose sense of mission or purpose. Jung documented that the inflated person often looks individuated to casual observers. They speak confidently about psychological concepts. They may have impressive spiritual experiences. They often gather followers. But they lack the groundedness, the ordinariness, the psychological honesty that marks genuine individuation. The mechanism is that encountering archetypal material is intoxicating. When your ego first touches the self, the vastness beyond personal consciousness, it's overwhelming. The ego's defensive response is often to claim, "I am this vastness," rather than, "I am relating to this vastness." Jung contrasted inflation with genuine self-realization. The individuated person knows their ego is not the totality. They've established relationship with the self while maintaining ego as center of consciousness. The inflated person has lost this distinction. The ego believes it is the self. One is humble recognition of vastness. The other is grandiose identification with power. The tragedy is that inflation prevents further development. Once you believe you've completed the journey, you stop doing the work. You defend your inflated self-image rather than continuing to integrate unconscious material. You become fixated at whatever stage triggered the inflation, unable to progress further. Jung noted that deflation inevitably follows inflation. Life presents challenges your inflated ego cannot handle. You experience failure, betrayal, loss, or crisis that reveals you're not as transcendent as you claimed. The inflation collapses, often into depression, rage, or paranoia. The protection against inflation is what Jung called the death of the ego's identification with the self, the third and final ego death required for genuine individuation. Jung discovered that genuine individuation requires 3 distinct ego deaths, each involving the dissolution of structures the ego has built its identity on. These aren't metaphorical deaths. They're psychological experiences of disintegration that feel like actual dying. The first ego death occurs when you recognize that your persona, your social identity, roles, achievements, is not who you are. Jung described this as the death of who you thought you were. This death is triggered when you can no longer maintain identification with your social masks. You look at your accomplished career and feel empty. You examine your relationships and realize you're playing roles. You consider your achievements and they feel hollow. Jung documented that this death feels like losing yourself because you've built your entire identity on persona. When persona no longer provides meaning, you experience existential void. Many people interpret this as depression and seek medication to restore their ability to identify with their roles. But it's not pathology. It's the necessary death that precedes rebirth. The experience involves grief. You're mourning the loss of your idealized self-image, the person you believed yourself to be, the identity you spent decades constructing. Even though the persona was a mask, it provided stability. Its death leaves you disoriented. Jung taught that you must allow this death. You cannot skip past it by immediately constructing a new persona. You must dwell in the void where you don't know who you are apart from your roles. Only by tolerating this not knowing does authentic self-knowledge emerge. The death is complete when you can function in your social roles without deriving your identity from them. You can be a parent, partner, professional, but these are things you do, not who you are. The center of your identity has shifted from external role to internal experience. The second ego death occurs during shadow and anima, or animus integration, when you realize your ego is not in control of your psyche. Jung called this the death of ego omnipotence. For most of your life, you've believed, "I am my conscious mind. My thoughts, decisions, and will define me." Then through shadow work, you discover that much of your behavior is driven by unconscious forces. Through anima, our animus work, you realize entire aspects of your personality have been operating autonomously without your awareness. The ego experiences this as a death because its primary function is organizing and controlling consciousness. When you recognize that vast unconscious forces operate beyond ego control, that you're not the sole author of your life, the ego's sense of omnipotence dies. Jung wrote that this death is necessary because ego omnipotence is an illusion. The ego is not the totality and cannot control the totality. Believing it can creates exhaustion, anxiety, and rigidity. But acknowledging the ego's limits feels like powerlessness, which the ego resists with everything it has. The experience manifests as loss of control. You make resolutions you cannot keep. You discover your unconscious sabotages, your conscious intentions. You realize that no matter how much you try to change through willpower alone, deeper patterns keep reasserting themselves. Many people interpret this as personal failure. I'm weak, I lack discipline, something's wrong with me. But Jung taught that this experience is not failure. It's the recognition that ego alone cannot transform the psyche. You must establish conscious relationship with unconscious forces rather than trying to dominate them. The death is complete when you stop trying to force change through ego will and instead begin listening to unconscious communications, dreams, symptoms, projections, synchronicities. You shift from I must control my psyche to I must understand what my psyche is trying to communicate. The third and most subtle ego death occurs at the threshold of self-realization when you must die to the fantasy of becoming the self. Jung described this as the death that prevents inflation. This death is necessary because when the ego first encounters the self, the totality of the psyche, the experience is so profound that the ego's instinct is to identify with it. You touch something vast, sacred, transpersonal, and you think, I am this, I am divine, I have transcended ordinary humanity. Jung taught that this is the most dangerous moment in individuation. If the ego identifies with the self, you become inflated, grandiose, unable to hear criticism, convinced of your special status. This is not individuation. This is psychosis wearing spiritual robes. The third death requires recognizing, I am not the self. I am the ego relating to the self. The self is vastly greater than my conscious ego. My ego must remain ego, limited, human, ordinary, while serving the self's intentions. This death feels like losing transcendence. You had an experience of unlimited consciousness, and now you must accept that your ego is still limited. You touch the divine, and now you must return to being human. The ego experiences this as devastating deflation, but Jung was clear. This death is what prevents the catastrophic inflation that destroys so many spiritual seekers. You must die to the fantasy of transcending human limits. You remain human, flawed, limited, mortal, but now conscious of your relationship to something greater. This is individuation, not becoming God, becoming fully human while serving the divine. The death is complete when you can have experiences of expanded consciousness without claiming special status because of them. You can access self-wisdom without believing you are the source of that wisdom. You can serve transpersonal purposes while accepting your personal limitations. Jung reflected that most people who encounter the self never complete this third death. They remain inflated, teaching transcendence they haven't embodied, claiming enlightenment that's actually ego identification with archetypal power. True individuation requires this final death, the death of the ego's fantasy of becoming divine. These three deaths, of persona identification, of ego omnipotence, of ego self-fusion, are what make individuation so rare. Most people cannot tolerate even the first death. Those who survive it often cannot accept the second. And those who encounter the self rarely complete the third death that prevents inflation. But for those willing to die these deaths, Jung developed specific guidance for how to proceed safely through the individuation process without triggering fragmentation or inflation. After observing both successful individuation and catastrophic failures, Jung developed specific guidance for determining readiness and proceeding safely. This wasn't a prescriptive formula. Individuation is unique for each person. But Jung identified patterns that distinguish healthy development from premature attempt. Jung taught that you should not consciously pursue individuation until certain conditions are met. Attempting it prematurely creates the disasters I've documented throughout my career. The first condition is stable ego functioning. You must be able to maintain consistent identity across contexts, tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty, make and keep commitments, regulate your emotions adequately, and function independently in practical life. If you struggle with these basics, build ego strength before attempting deeper work. The second condition is adequate life structure. Jung noted that individuation is not escape from life. You must have handled basic life tasks, financial stability, meaningful work, functional relationships. If you're using spiritual seeking to avoid these responsibilities, you're not ready. The third condition is psychological necessity. Individuation isn't something you should do because it sounds interesting or because you want to be special. Jung taught that individuation chooses you. It emerges as psychological necessity when persona life no longer suffices, when your current structure cannot contain what's emerging from your unconscious. The signs that individuation is becoming necessary include recurrent dreams with archetypal imagery, persistent feeling that your life doesn't fit, increasing inability to maintain your persona without feeling fraudulent, spontaneous emergence of synchronicities, or psychological symptoms that resist conventional treatment. Jung was clear: if you're stable and content in persona life, don't disturb it. Individuation is not a goal to pursue. It's a response to psychological necessity when your current structure becomes inadequate. Once individuation has become psychologically necessary and you meet the readiness conditions, Jung's guidance emphasized gradual integration rather than forced transformation. The first principle is move slowly. Jung taught that the unconscious will present material at the rate you can integrate it. If you're not experiencing dreams, synchronicities, or symptoms demanding attention, don't force deeper work. Trust the psyche's timing. The method involves establishing regular practices for engaging the unconscious, recording and working with dreams, practicing active imagination when appropriate, noting synchronicities without obsessing over them, and maintaining relationship with a guide, either a Jungian analyst or someone further along the path who can provide grounded perspective. Jung emphasized that you cannot do this work alone. The unconscious has tremendous power to seduce, terrify, or inflate you. You need external perspective from someone who can distinguish genuine integration from inflation, healthy development from psychotic process. The second principle is maintain your ordinary life while doing the work. Jung noted that people who abandon their responsibilities to pursue transformation are not individuating. They're dissociating. Continue your work, relationships, and daily practices while gradually integrating unconscious material. This creates tension. You're maintaining outer structure while inner transformation occurs. But Jung taught that this tension is necessary. The container of your ordinary life prevents you from being overwhelmed by unconscious forces. Abandoning structure risks psychological flooding. The third principle is integrate symbolically before acting literally. When unconscious material emerges through dreams, active imagination, or synchronicity, don't immediately change your external life based on it. Jung's method was to first integrate the message symbolically, create art representing it, write about it, dialogue with the symbolic figures, ritualize its meaning. Jung observed that unconscious contents must be metabolized symbolically before literal action. People who act immediately on dreams or visions often act out rather than integrating. The symbol gets concretized, losing its transformative power. Only after symbolic integration should you consider whether external changes are appropriate. And even then, Jung taught to move gradually, testing whether changes serve individuation or whether they're unconscious acting out. Jung identified specific warning signs that individuation work is proceeding too quickly or unsafely. The first warning is loss of ability to function in ordinary life. If your psychological work is causing you to neglect responsibilities, lose employment, damage relationships, or become unable to handle basic life tasks, you're going too fast. Jung taught to slow down, strengthen ego functioning, return to practical life before going deeper. The second warning is grandiosity or inflation. If you're beginning to believe you have special powers, unique insights unavailable to others, or that you've transcended ordinary human limitations, stop immediately. Jung noted that this is not individuation, this is inflation. You need deflation through confrontation with your actual limits before continuing. The third warning is inability to distinguish inner and outer. If you're confused about whether experiences are internal psychological events or external reality, if boundaries between self and other are blurring, if you're having difficulty distinguishing fantasy from fact, you're experiencing psychotic process, not individuation. Jung was definitive. Individuation strengthens the ego's capacity for reality testing. If your work is weakening your grasp on consensus reality, you've triggered psychological flooding. Seek professional help immediately. The fourth warning is social isolation. While some degree of solitude is necessary for individuation, if you're completely withdrawing from human contact, if you believe no one understands you, if you're only comfortable in altered states or inner world, you're dissociating, not individuating. Jung taught that individuation should make you more capable of genuine human relationship, not less. If you're becoming more isolated, more unable to connect, something has gone wrong. The protection against these dangers is maintaining connection with embodied life, continuing relationship with a skilled guide, and proceeding at the pace unconscious material naturally emerges rather than forcing depth work prematurely. But understanding the method doesn't tell you whether you're actually individuating or merely fantasizing about transformation while remaining psychologically unchanged. Jung identified 6 specific signs that distinguish genuine individuation from its counterfeits. How do you know whether you're actually individuating or whether you're trapped in inflation, spiritual bypassing, or intellectual understanding without embodied change? Jung documented 6 specific characteristics that distinguish genuine individuation from psychological counterfeits. The first sign of genuine individuation is that you become progressively less dependent on external approval or validation. Jung taught that the individuating person develops an internal authority, not ego authority, but connection to self that provides guidance independent of collective opinion. Before individuation, you need others to confirm you're good, right, successful, or valuable. Your sense of worth depends on external feedback. You're devastated by criticism and inflated by praise because your identity is externally constructed. As individuation progresses, this dependency decreases. You can receive feedback without your identity collapsing or inflating. You can be criticized without experiencing it as attack, praised without needing more. You're no longer performing for an audience because your life has become response to internal necessity rather than external expectation. Jung noted that this doesn't make you arrogant or dismissive of others. It makes you genuinely open to feedback because you're not defensive about protecting a false self-image. You can hear criticism because you're no longer identified with an idealized persona. If you're claiming to individuate but still desperately need acknowledgement, still comparing yourself to others, still seeking validation through social media presence or follow accounts, you haven't yet established the ego-self axis that makes you internally grounded. Jung taught that the individuating person develops what I call the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing truths in tension without collapsing into either or thinking. Before individuation, you experience yourself and others in binary categories, good or bad, right or wrong, success or failure. You cannot tolerate ambiguity. You need clear answers and become anxious when situations resist simple categorization. As individuation progresses, you develop capacity for both and thinking. You can hold, I am capable of great kindness and great cruelty. This person has wounded me and also genuinely loves me. I succeeded and also failed. This outcome is both gift and loss. Jung noted that the individuated person can hold these opposites without splitting, without defensive simplification. This creates psychological depth, the capacity to see complexity, to live in nuance, to tolerate not knowing. If you're still seeing yourself as purely good, with shadow projected onto others, still dividing people into categories of enlightened versus unenlightened, still needing absolute certainty, you haven't integrated the opposites that individuation requires. The third sign is that your relationship to symbols, dreams, and meaning deepens. Jung taught that the individuating person develops what I call a symbolic life, existence organized around symbols that connect conscious and unconscious, personal and archetypal. Before individuation, dreams seem meaningless or you don't remember them. Synchronicities don't register. Symbolic art or ritual feels unnecessary or self-indulgent. Your life is organized entirely around practical, literal concerns. As individuation progresses, symbols become alive. You have dreams that feel significant, and you work to understand them. You notice synchronicities without obsessing over them. You may create art, engage in ritual, or develop practices that express symbolic meaning. Your life becomes oriented around purposes that transcend practical survival or success. Jung noted that this is not escape from practical life. The individuated person handles practical matters effectively, but practical life is now contained within a larger framework of meaning rather than being the sole organizing principle. If your life remains entirely literal, if dreams are just brain static, if meaning is a concept you understand intellectually but don't experience, if your days are organized only around practical productivity, symbolic life hasn't developed, which suggests individuation hasn't progressed beyond early stages. Jung taught that you know you're individuating when you can function in your social roles without deriving your identity from them. Before individuation, you are your job, your achievements, your relationships. When asked who you are, you list roles and accomplishments. When these are threatened, you experience identity crisis. As individuation progresses, you develop what Jung called psychological distance from persona. You can perform your roles competently without believing the role is who you are. You're a parent, partner, professional. But these are expressions of yourself, not definitions of yourself. Jung observed that this creates a paradox. The individuated person often performs their roles more effectively because they're not neurotically attached to them. They can focus on the task rather than on whether the task confirms their identity. If losing your job, ending a relationship, or failing at a project would devastate your sense of self, if you still introduce yourself primarily through roles and achievements, persona identification remains strong, suggesting you're still in stage 1 of individuation. The fifth sign Jung identified is that you stop trying to eliminate suffering and instead recognize it as essential to psychological development. Before individuation, you believe suffering is a problem to solve or escape. You seek happiness, comfort, pleasure. You interpret psychological pain as evidence something's wrong that needs fixing. As individuation progresses, your relationship to suffering transforms. Jung taught that you recognize that psychological suffering, not trauma, but the necessary pain of growth, serves individuation. The death of persona causes suffering. Shadow integration is painful, ego deaths hurt. But this suffering is not pathology, it's transformation. The individuated person doesn't seek suffering masochistically, but neither do they avoid necessary suffering. They can distinguish between productive suffering that serves growth and neurotic suffering that's defensive repetition. Jung noted that modern culture cannot understand this. It pathologizes all psychological pain and offers medication or distraction to eliminate it. But some suffering cannot and should not be eliminated. It's the birth pangs of new consciousness. If you're still primarily seeking comfort, still avoiding any psychological pain, still believing the goal is happiness rather than wholeness, you haven't accepted the reality that individuation requires suffering. The final sign Jung documented is that genuine individuation leads to what he called vocation, not a career, but a calling that emerges from the self. Jung taught that everyone who individuates discovers they have unique work in the world that only they can do, not because they're special, but because their specific combination of qualities, experiences, and development creates capacity for specific contribution. Before individuation, you choose work based on practical concerns, money, status, family expectations, or random opportunity. The work may be competent, but it doesn't feel deeply aligned with who you are. As individuation progresses, vocation begins emerging. You discover work that feels necessary, not because it makes you happy or successful, but because not doing it would be betraying something essential in yourself. The work may or may not provide financial security or recognition, but it provides meaning. Jung noted that vocation is not always your paid employment. It might be creative work, service, teaching, or any activity through which your individuated self expresses itself in the world. The mark of vocation is that it feels like responding to demand from the self rather than pursuing ego desire. If you're still choosing life direction based primarily on external rewards, if work feels like obligation rather than calling, if you haven't discovered what you're uniquely suited to contribute, vocation hasn't emerged, suggesting self-realization hasn't occurred. These 6 signs: decreased external validation need, capacity for paradox, symbolic life, persona distance, suffering acceptance, and vocation, together distinguish genuine individuation from intellectual understanding, spiritual inflation, or persona adjustment mistaken for transformation. But the clearest way to understand individuation is through contrast, seeing who actually completed the journey versus who claimed completion while remaining psychologically unchanged. Jung spent his career observing people's attempts at individuation. 2 contrasting cases reveal what determines whether someone completes the journey or becomes trapped in its counterfeit. Jung's own psychological development provides the clearest template for genuine individuation precisely because he documented it honestly, including his failures and near catastrophes. His individuation began with his break from Freud in 1913, the death of his professional persona as Freud's successor. He lost his position in the psychoanalytic movement, his colleagues dismissed him, and his identity as rising star of psychiatry collapsed. Jung described this as the first death. I no longer knew who I was apart from the role I'd been playing. Rather than immediately constructing a new persona, Jung allowed himself to dwell in not knowing. He wrote, "For years I had no position, no recognition, no clear direction. I had to tolerate this void. Most people cannot. They immediately seek new roles, new identities, but I knew something was trying to emerge that required me to remain undefined." His Red Book period, 1913-1930, represented his confrontation with shadow and archetypal material. He encountered autonomous figures in his psyche, Philemon, Salome, Ka, who claimed independent existence. He experienced visions of apocalyptic destruction that preceded World War I. He descended into what felt like voluntary psychosis. But Jung maintained what he called one foot in the world. He continued his clinical practice, maintained his family life, and never completely abandoned rational thought, even while engaging material that challenged rationality. He wrote, "I could have been overwhelmed completely. What saved me was maintaining ordinary life while exploring the extraordinary. I saw patients during the day, then descended into my visions at night." His integration of the anima, particularly through his relationship with Tony Wolfe alongside his marriage to Emma, was controversial but psychologically honest. Jung recognized he was projecting his anima onto both women and spent years developing his own feminine psychological capacities rather than remaining dependent on projection. In his later years, Jung demonstrated all 6 signs of genuine individuation. He was remarkably unconcerned with professional recognition, continuing to develop unconventional theories even when they damaged his reputation. He could hold profound paradoxes, scientific rigor alongside mystical openness. His symbolic life was rich, painting mandalas, building his tower at Bollingen, engaging synchronicities. He disidentified from his persona as famous psychiatrist. He accepted suffering as necessary, and his vocation emerged clearly, not just treating patients, but developing depth psychology as path for others. Most importantly, Jung maintained humility about his development. Near his death, he didn't claim to have completed individuation. He wrote, "I have caught glimpses of the self-established relationship with depths beyond my ego, but I remain human, flawed, limited. I have not transcended. I have become more completely what I specifically am." The outcome of Jung's individuation was not perfection or transcendence, but embodied wholeness. He remained capable of anger, error, and blindness, but he'd integrated enough unconscious material that he could function from depth rather than defended persona. He'd established ego-self-axis that allowed him to serve purposes beyond personal desire. Jung documented a contrasting case. A patient who went through extensive analytical work, claimed to have completed individuation, then demonstrated through his life that he'd achieved inflation, not wholeness. The patient had been in analysis for 6 years. He'd worked with his dreams, explored his shadow, engaged active imagination, experienced powerful synchronicities. He could speak eloquently about Jungian concepts and believed he'd achieved self-realization. He terminated analysis, convinced he'd completed the journey. Within months, he began teaching workshops on individuation, positioning himself as someone who'd achieved what others were seeking. He gathered followers, spoke with certainty about psychological truth, and dismissed anyone who questioned him. Jung observed him over the following decade and noted clear signs of inflation rather than individuation. The patient had developed what Jung called mana personality, identification with archetypal power. He believed his insights were divinely inspired. He couldn't tolerate criticism without experiencing it as attack by unconscious people. He split people into categories of awakened versus unawakened. Most tellingly, the patient's life demonstrated none of the signs of genuine individuation. He remained desperate for external validation, needing constant acknowledgement of his special status. He couldn't hold paradox. Everything was absolute truth or absolute falsehood. His symbolic life had died. He no longer worked with dreams or engaged his own unconscious, convinced he'd transcended the need. He'd constructed a new spiritual persona more rigid than his original social persona. He couldn't tolerate psychological suffering, interpreting any pain as evidence he was under psychic attack. And his vocation was teaching others how to achieve what he claimed to have achieved, making him financially dependent on maintaining his inflation. Jung wrote, "He confused the beginning of archetypal encounter with completion of individuation. He touched the self and immediately identified with it, believing, 'I am enlightened,' rather than, 'I am establishing relationship with something vastly greater than my ego.' This identification prevented further development. He became fixed at the moment of inflation, unable to complete the third death that would have established genuine ego-self-axis. After 15 years of teaching individuation, the patient experienced devastating personal crisis. His marriage collapsed, his health failed, and his followers dwindled. The inflation could no longer sustain itself against reality's feedback. Jung documented that he came back to analysis, finally willing to acknowledge he hadn't completed individuation. He'd been inflated, but decades had been lost. He had to begin again, this time with humility about his actual developmental stage. What separated Jung's genuine individuation from his patient's inflation? Jung identified the critical factors. First, Jung maintained critical distance even during the most intense archetypal experiences. He documented them, theorized about them, but never claimed they made him special. The patient immediately identified with his experiences, claiming they proved his enlightenment. Second, Jung continued developing throughout his life. He never claimed completion, never stopped working with his dreams, never believed he'd transcended the need for psychological work. The patient believed he'd arrived, which stopped his development completely. Third, Jung embodied ordinariness alongside depth. He could be petty, angry, limited, and he acknowledged these qualities. The patient constructed an idealized self-image that couldn't accommodate human limitation without collapsing. Fourth, Jung served something beyond his ego. His work was response to necessity, not ego ambition. The patient's teaching served his need for validation and status. Fifth, Jung accepted suffering without believing it meant he'd failed. The patient interpreted any suffering as evidence something was wrong, never recognizing that continued suffering is part of ongoing development. Jung's final reflection was clear. The difference between individuation and inflation is humility. The individuated person knows they're not the self. They're in relationship with the self. They remain ordinary while serving the extraordinary. The inflated person believes they've become the self, transcended ordinariness, achieved special status. This belief prevents genuine individuation from ever occurring. Most people never become psychologically whole. They live fragmented, identified with their persona, projecting their shadow, seeking completion in others, unconscious of the vast depths within them. They die having never discovered who they actually were beneath their roles, never integrated what they rejected, never established relationship with the totality of their psyche. This isn't moral failure. Individuation is extraordinarily difficult. It requires dying multiple deaths, each involving the dissolution of structures you've built your identity on. It demands you face social rejection for becoming authentically yourself rather than conforming to collective expectations. It requires distinguishing between genuine self-realization and ego inflation, masquerading as enlightenment. You're not broken if you haven't individuated. Jung was clear that most people aren't called to this journey. They can live full, meaningful lives through persona identification, never needing to question it. Individuation is not a goal everyone should pursue. It's a response to psychological necessity when your current structure becomes inadequate to contain what's emerging from your unconscious. But if individuation has chosen you, if you can no longer maintain your persona without feeling fraudulent, if your shadow is erupting despite your defenses, if synchronicities are demanding your attention, then you face a choice. You can attempt to suppress what's emerging, strengthening your defenses, retreating into more rigid conformity. Or you can accept the call and begin the journey toward wholeness. Jung's method offers guidance. Ensure your ego structure is stable before beginning. Move slowly, integrating at the pace your unconscious presents material. Maintain ordinary life while doing the work. Integrate symbolically before acting literally. Work with a guide who can distinguish development from inflation. Watch for warning signs that you're proceeding too fast or inflating. And most critically, complete the 3 deaths that individuation requires. Let your persona identity die so you can discover who you are beneath your roles. Let your ego's omnipotence die so you can establish relationship with unconscious forces rather than trying to dominate them. Let your fantasy of becoming divine die so you can remain human while serving the transpersonal. The outcome of genuine individuation is not transcendence or perfection. It's embodied wholeness. You remain human, flawed, limited, ordinary. But you've integrated enough unconscious material that you can function from depth rather than defended surface. You've established connection with purposes beyond personal desire. You've become who you specifically are, rather than who collective culture demanded you be. Comment below which stage of individuation you recognize yourself in. Stage 1 for confronting persona, Stage 2 for shadow work, Stage 3 for animus integration, or Stage 4 for self-realization. Let's build a community of people actually doing the work, rather than fantasizing about transformation while remaining unchanged. If this exploration of why most people never become whole transformed your understanding, hit that like button. You've joined the rare few who understand that wholeness isn't found. It's forged through decades of difficult psychological work that most people refuse to do. Subscribe for more Jung deep cuts, the concepts beyond the introductory level that reveal what individuation actually requires versus what spiritual culture claims it requires. And if you haven't watched my foundational Jung series, Red Book, Shadow Integration, Animus Projection, and Synchronicity, watch those first. This video synthesizes those concepts into the complete individuation journey. You need the foundation before attempting the work. Together, these 5 videos give you Jung's complete map, where he discovered the path, how to integrate your darkness, how to stop projecting onto partners, how to recognize external signs you're on the path, and what the destination actually is. Most people never become whole because individuation is too difficult, too costly, too demanding of everything ego has built. Jung proved it's possible to complete the journey without losing your mind, but only if you proceed with honesty, humility, and respect for the immensity of what you're attempting. The question isn't whether you should individuate. The question is whether individuation has become psychologically necessary for you, and whether you have the courage to die the deaths required for genuine wholeness. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.